Already called the police. Don't move. The words cut across the quiet suburban street, like a siren before the siren ever arrived. Every head turned. Lawns half-trimmed. Coffee cups paused midair. Conversations died mid-sentence. And standing there at the edge of a freshly paved sidewalk that still smelled faintly of asphalt and promise was Darius Cole. He didn't flinch. Not when Ethan Whitmore stepped closer. Not when the phone was raised, camera pointed straight at his face. Not when the accusation settled into the air like it belonged there. "You don't live here," Ethan added, louder this time, as if volume made it truth. "You don't belong in this neighborhood." A few doors down, someone opened their garage halfway, just enough to watch without being seen. A woman walking her golden retriever slowed her pace, pretending to check her messages while her eyes stayed locked on the scene. The neighborhood had that look: clean driveways, new mailboxes, identical stone facades catching the late afternoon sun. The kind of place where everything felt curated, controlled, protected. And right now, Darius Cole stood in the middle of it like a disruption no one wanted to understand. He wore a plain charcoal t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers with just enough dust on them to suggest he'd been walking the site. No watch, no logo, no signal of status, just stillness. The kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable because it refused to explain itself. Ethan took another step forward, his jaw tight, his confidence growing with every pair of eyes that gathered. "I've never seen you around here," he said, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "And this is a private development. Residents only." Darius looked past him, not at him. His gaze moved across the row of houses, unfinished in places, perfect in others. Measuring, calculating, remembering something no one else in that moment could see. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint hum of distant traffic and the sharper tension building right here on this street. A teenager across the road lifted his phone, subtle at first, then steadier. Recording, because something about this moment felt like it was going to matter. "You hear me?" Ethan snapped, stepping directly into Darius's line of sight now. "Police are on the way. So whatever you're doing here, you better start explaining." Still, no reaction. No defense. No raised voice. Just a slow inhale. Then stillness again. The kind that didn't back down. A woman near the corner finally spoke. Hesitant. "Ethan, maybe he's just no." Ethan cut her off instantly, sharp, decisive. "This is exactly how it starts. You let one person wander in. Next thing you know," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The implication hung there, heavy and familiar. A few people nodded. Others stayed quiet, watching, waiting, deciding which side felt safer. Darius shifted his weight slightly, the only movement he'd made since it began. His eyes dropped for half a second to the pavement beneath his feet, the same pavement poured just weeks ago, still holding the faint lines of fresh work. Then he looked back up, not at Ethan, but through him, as if the confrontation wasn't the point, as if something bigger was already in motion. Somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, the sound of a police siren began to rise. Soft at first, then clearer, closer. The neighborhood seemed to tighten around it. People straightened, phones lifted higher. The moment was no longer private. It was becoming something else, something public, something irreversible. Ethan exhaled, a small, satisfied smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Good," he muttered. "We'll sort this out the right way." Darius didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't move to leave. He simply stood there, anchored in place, as if the ground itself had a reason to keep him exactly where he was. And as the sirens grew louder, as the tension stretched thinner and sharper with every passing second, one thing became unmistakably clear to anyone paying close enough attention. He wasn't waiting to be proven wrong. He was waiting for something else entirely, something that hadn't arrived yet, but was already on its way. The sirens grew louder until they filled the entire block, bouncing off the clean facades and echoing between half-finished homes like a warning that had already chosen its side. A black and white patrol car turned the corner slowly, deliberate, its tires rolling over the new pavement with a low, steady hum before coming to a stop just a few feet from where Darius stood. The engine idled. The lights flashed once, then twice, casting brief pulses of red and blue across the polished windows of houses that had not yet been lived in. Doors opened. Two officers stepped out, their movements calm but practiced, eyes scanning the scene before settling on the only person not speaking. Ethan was already moving toward them, eager, confident, his voice rising just enough to sound cooperative but urgent. "Officers, thank you for coming. This man has been loitering here. He refuses to leave. This is a private neighborhood." One of the officers, a tall man with a measured expression, nodded slightly as he approached. His partner hung back a step, observing the crowd, the phones, the subtle shift in energy that had turned a quiet street into something closer to a stage. "Sir," the officer said, directing his voice at Darius now, "we got a call about a situation. Can you tell me what is going on?" Darius turned his head slowly, meeting the officer's gaze for the first time. "No tensión, no hositación." Just a quiet acknowledgement that the next part had begun. "I'm standing," he said, his voice even controlled. The simplicity of the answer hung there, almost unsettling in its precision. Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You see what I mean? He will not even answer a simple question. I asked him to leave. He would not. This is not public property." A few neighbors murmured in agreement. Others stayed silent, their attention fixed on Darius, trying to read something in his stillness that refused to give them anything back. The officer shifted his stance slightly, his tone remaining professional but firmer now. "Sir, do you live here?" A pause. "Not long. Just enough to feel intentional." "Not in the way you are asking," Darius replied. The answer caused a ripple through the small crowd. Confusion, irritation, curiosity. Ethan stepped forward again, frustration starting to edge into his voice. "That does not even make sense. Either you live here or you do not." Darius did not look at him. He kept his attention on the officer, as if the rest of the noise did not qualify as part of the conversation. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. The second officer, who had been watching quietly, took a step closer now. Her eyes moved from Darius to Ethan, then to the houses lining the street, as if trying to piece together something that had not been said out loud yet. "Sir," she added, "we just need to understand why you are here today." The question lingered, softer than the others, but carrying weight. Darius let his gaze drift once more across the neighborhood. The freshly installed street signs, the uniform mailboxes, the symmetry of homes designed to look identical, yet priced to feel exclusive. For a brief moment, something passed through his expression. Not anger, not frustration, memory. Then it was gone. "I am reviewing the site," he said. Ethan scoffed immediately, shaking his head. "Reviewing? That is not how this works. You do not just walk into a development and start reviewing anything. There are processes. There are permissions." The word permission landed harder than he intended, exposing more than he realized. The officer glanced at Ethan briefly, then back at Darius. "Do you have any identification on you, sir?" The question was routine, expected, the kind of request that usually ended things quickly. But Darius did not reach for his pocket. He did not move at all. "I do," he said calmly, "but I would prefer not to present it under these assumptions." That shifted something, subtle but real. The air tightened again. Ethan's voice rose, sharper now. "Assumptions? The only assumption here is that you are somewhere you're not supposed to be." A phone chimed in the background as someone adjusted their grip, zooming in closer. The moment was building again, layer by layer. The first officer exhaled slowly, keeping his tone controlled. "Sir, we are just trying to resolve this. If you can show us identification, we can clear things up and everyone can move on." Darius held his gaze, steady, unblinking. "That depends," he said quietly, "on what you think needs to be cleared up." The question did not challenge. It reframed, and for the first time since the officers arrived, neither of them responded immediately, because suddenly, the situation did not feel as simple as it had a minute ago. Around them, the neighborhood waited, not for resolution, but for something else, something that had not revealed itself yet, but was getting closer with every second. The silence after his question did not feel empty. It felt loaded. like something had shifted beneath the surface that no one could quite name yet. The officers exchanged a brief glance, the kind that carried more than words ever could. Around them, the small crowd had grown thicker, tighter, as if the street itself was pulling people closer to the tension instead of pushing them away. Phones were no longer subtle. They were up, steady, focused, recording every second. Ethan crossed his arms, his confidence still intact, but now edged with impatience. "This is not complicated," he said, his voice cutting back into the space that Darius had just reshaped. "He is on private property and refuses to identify himself. That is enough." The first officer nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on Darius. Something about the man's posture, his stillness, the absence of urgency, did not align with the situation Ethan was describing. People who did not belong usually explained. They justified. They tried to leave before things escalated. Darius did none of that. He stood as if the ground had been assigned to him long before anyone else arrived. The second officer stepped slightly to the side, widening her view of the street. She noticed the construction markers near the curb, the temporary signage posted near the entrance, the faint outline of a development name printed on a banner further down the block, partially covered by wind. This was not just a neighborhood. Not yet. It was something in transition. "Sir," she said carefully, "you mentioned you were reviewing the site. Can you clarify what you mean by that?" Darius turned his head just enough to acknowledge her voice. "I mean exactly that," he replied. "I am reviewing the site. No extra detail. No explanation offered to make it easier. Just the same calm delivery that forced everyone else to work harder to understand." Ethan let out a breath through his nose, visibly frustrated now. "He is playing games," he said, looking at the officers. "You can see that. Nobody talks like that unless they are hiding something." A few people nodded again, more confidently this time, feeding off the certainty in his tone. But not everyone agreed. The woman with the golden retriever had stopped completely now, her phone lowered, her eyes studying Darius with a different kind of attention. Not suspicion, recognition of something she could not quite place. "He does not seem like he is hiding," she said quietly, almost to herself. Ethan turned toward her immediately. "Then what is he doing?" he challenged. She hesitated, searching for the right word. "Waiting," she said finally. The word landed softer than the others, but it lingered longer. Waiting. It reframed everything again. The officers felt it too. The first officer shifted his weight, his tone changing just slightly. Less directive, more curious. "Waiting for what?" he asked. For the first time, Darius looked directly at him. Fully. Not through him. Not past him. At him. "For the right moment," he said. The answer did not raise his voice. It did not need to. It settled into the space like something inevitable. Ethan shook his head, almost laughing now, but there was less certainty in it. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "You're going to let him stand here and talk in riddles?" The second officer exhaled slowly, her attention still fixed on Darius. "We are going to understand the situation before we escalate it," she said. The choice of words mattered. Escalate. Because even she could feel that they were already close to a line that, once crossed, would not be easy to step back from. A car door slammed somewhere down the street. Not loud, but distinct enough to draw attention. Several heads turned instinctively. A black SUV had just pulled up near the entrance of the development, its engine still running, its presence quiet but intentional. No one from the crowd recognized it. Not immediately. But Darius did not turn to look. He did not need to. His posture remained exactly the same. Grounded. Certain. As if whatever had just arrived was not a surprise, but a continuation. The officer followed the direction of the crowd's gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you know them?" he asked, nodding toward the vehicle. A small pause. Then Darius answered, his voice steady, almost reflective. "Yes," he said. "They know exactly why I am here." The statement did not explain. It confirmed. And just like that, the energy on the street shifted again. Subtle, but undeniable. Because now, for the first time since the confrontation began, the question was no longer just about whether Darius belonged there. It was about who else did. The engine of the black SUV idled low, almost blending into the hum of the neighborhood, but its presence carried weight that did not need volume to be felt. Doors did not open right away. No one rushed out. It just sat there, deliberate, as if timing mattered more than speed. The crowd noticed. Conversations lowered into whispers. Phones adjusted their angles. Even Ethan paused for half a second, his eyes narrowing toward the vehicle before snapping back to Darius, unwilling to lose control of the moment he believed he had already secured. "Who is that?" he asked, the question sharp but edged now with something else. Uncertainty. Darius did not answer immediately. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the vehicle in the way everyone else expected. Instead, he looked at the officer in front of him, calm, centered, as if the real conversation had never left that space. "You asked what needs to be cleared up," he said quietly. "You are about to find out." The words landed with precision. Not dramatic, not loud, just certain. The first officer followed his gaze for a brief moment, then looked back at him, something in his posture shifting again. Less authority, more attention. The second officer turned fully now toward the SUV, her instincts pulling her focus there as the rear door finally opened. A man stepped out first. Mid-40s, clean suit. Not flashy, but exact. The kind of presence that did not need introduction to be recognized as important. He adjusted his jacket once, scanned the street, and then his eyes found Darius. Immediately, without hesitation. That alone changed something. Behind him, a second figure emerged, a woman carrying a tablet. Her movements efficient, practiced, her attention already on the screen before she even fully cleared the vehicle. They did not walk quickly. They walked directly, straight down the sidewalk toward the center of the scene where everything had already begun to unravel. The crowd parted without being asked. Not dramatically, just enough to create a path. People felt it before they understood it. This was not random. This was not coincidence. Ethan stepped slightly forward again, trying to reassert himself, his voice lifting just enough to reclaim attention. "Hey," he called out toward the approaching figures. "This is a private matter. We have already contacted the police." The man in the suit did not respond to him, not even a glance. His focus remained on Darius, and as he closed the distance, something else became clear. Respect, not the kind performed for appearance. The kind that exists before words are spoken. The officers noticed it too. The first officer straightened slightly, his eyes moving between Darius and the approaching man, recalculating the situation in real time. The second officer took a small step back, creating space without fully realizing why. The woman with the tablet reached them first. She stopped just beside Darius, not in front of him, not behind him, beside him. Her screen turned slightly, angled away from the crowd, but visible enough to the officers standing closest. Data. Structured. Official. The kind that does not need explanation when you know how to read it. "Everything is ready," she said, her voice low but clear, directed only at Darius. No introduction. No question. Just confirmation. The man in the suit stopped a step behind her, his gaze finally shifting to the officers. "Good afternoon," he said, his tone composed, controlled, carrying authority without force. "Is there an issue here?" Ethan let out a short, disbelieving laugh, stepping forward again, eager to regain control. "Yes, there is," he said quickly. "This man has been trespassing and refusing to identify himself." "We called you. You called the police," the man corrected calmly, cutting through his sentence without raising his voice. The distinction mattered. It landed heavier than Ethan expected. The officer cleared his throat slightly, stepping into space again, but now his tone had changed. Less assumption, more caution. "We are just trying to understand the situation," he said. The man nodded once, then turned his attention back to Darius, waiting, not prompting, not guiding, waiting. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Darius moved with intention. Not away, not defensive, forward, just one step, enough to shift the center of the moment completely. His eyes moved briefly across the faces in front of him. Ethan, the officers, the neighbors, the phones, every assumption, every judgment. every conclusion that had been made before anyone had asked the right question. Then he spoke, not loudly, not slowly, just clearly enough that no one could mistake it. "Let's clear it up," he said. And the street, which had been filled with noise just minutes ago, fell into a silence that felt earned. Because now, whatever came next was not going to be an argument. It was going to be the truth. For a brief second, no one moved. Not Ethan, not the officers, not even the people recording. It was the kind of silence that does not come from calm. It comes from anticipation. Darius reached out slightly, and the woman beside him turned the tablet just enough for him to see. He did not rush. He did not scan it like someone checking facts. He looked at it like someone confirming what he already knew. Then he lifted his eyes again, not to the crowd, but to the officer standing closest to him. "You asked for clarity," he said, his tone steady, controlled. "Let's start there." The officer nodded slowly, his posture no longer rigid, his attention fully engaged now. Darius gestured lightly toward the tablet. "This property," he continued, "from the entrance sign 200 yards down to the final lot at the end of this street, is part of a single development project." His voice carried just enough to reach the edges of the gathered crowd. People leaned in, not physically, but mentally, trying to follow something that was beginning to shift beyond their expectations. Ethan crossed his arms tighter, shaking his head. "We know that," he said quickly. "That is why it is private." Darius turned his head slightly toward him for the first time since the SUV arrived. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence. "Yes," he said, "it is private." The agreement was not concession. It was setup. He turned back to the officer. "What has not been understood," he continued, "is who that privacy belongs to." The words landed differently, slower, heavier. The second officer's eyes moved back to the tablet, her attention sharpening as the woman beside Darius tapped once on the screen. A document expanded. Clean. Official. Names. Dates. Ownership structure. The kind of information that does not argue. It confirms. Darius let a brief pause settle into the space, not to create drama, but to let the weight of what was about to be said have somewhere to land. And in that pause, something else surfaced. Not in the street. In his mind. A memory. Years earlier. A different property. A different street. He had stood outside a model home, dressed almost exactly the same. Simple. Intentional. Curious. The agent had smiled at him, but it had not reached her eyes. "We are closing up," she had said, even though the sign behind her clearly read open for another hour. He remembered the way the door had closed softly. Not slammed. Not aggressively. Just enough to make it clear he was not expected to step inside. He had not argued then, either. He had stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at a future someone else had already decided was not his. That memory did not linger. It sharpened. It focused. And then it disappeared as quickly as it came. Back to the present. Back to the street. Back to the moment that was no longer about assumption, but about fact. "Officer," Darius said, his voice pulling everything back into place, "you were told I do not belong here." The officer did not respond. He did not need to. The statement itself was enough. Darius took one small step forward, not toward anyone, but into the center of the moment that had been building since the first accusation. "You were told I was trespassing," he continued, "that I was refusing to identify myself, that I was somewhere I should not be." Each phrase matched what had already been said. Each one mirrored the narrative that had been constructed around him. Ethan shifted slightly, his confidence no longer as steady as it had been minutes ago. The crowd felt it, subtle but real. Darius let his gaze move across them now, not searching, not questioning, observing, measuring. Then he brought it back to the officer. "What you were not told," he said, "is that I am here by design." The phrase settled differently. Not defensive, not reactive, intentional. The woman with the tablet tapped again, and this time she turned the screen slightly more toward the officers. The second officer leaned in just enough to read. Her expression changed first. Not dramatically, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Recognition, not of the name yet, but of the structure, the legitimacy, the weight of documentation that does not get questioned lightly. The first officer followed her gaze, his brow tightening slightly as he processed what he was seeing. Ethan stepped forward again, faster this time, his voice rising in an attempt to regain control. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Anyone can pull up documents. That does not mean anything." But his words did not carry the same certainty anymore. They sounded like they were trying to catch up to something that had already moved ahead of them. Darius did not respond to him. He did not need to. Instead, he spoke one more time, his voice steady, clear, impossible to misinterpret. "You're not dealing with someone who wandered in," he said. "You are dealing with someone who built this from the ground up." And just like that, the story that had been told about him began to crack. Not loudly, not all at once, but enough for everyone standing there to realize that the version of reality they had accepted just minutes ago was no longer holding together the way it had before. The words did not echo. They settled. Heavy. Final. And for the first time since the confrontation began, no one rushed to fill the silence. The officers looked at the tablet again, longer this time, their focus narrowing as the details aligned into something undeniable. Names connected. Entities matched. Permits, filings, ownership layers all pointing in one direction, toward the man standing calmly in front of them. The second officer straightened slightly, her voice quieter now, but more precise. "Sir, can you confirm your name?" It was no longer a challenge. It was a request for verification. Darius met her gaze without hesitation. "Darius Cole," he said. The name moved through the air differently than everything else that had been said so far. It did not need volume. It carried recognition on its own terms. The man in the suit behind him gave a small nod, as if that alone completed the introduction that had never been formally made. The first officer inhaled slowly, processing, recalibrating, his posture adjusting in a way that signaled something had changed. "Mr. Cole," he said, the title coming naturally now, "are you stating that you are the developer of this property?" Darius did not rush the answer. He allowed the question to exist fully before responding, as if making sure everyone heard exactly what was being asked. "I am stating," he said, "that I am responsible for every phase of this project, from the land acquisition to the infrastructure you are standing on right now." He paused just long enough to let that settle, then added, "including the street we are having this conversation on." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of reaction that does not come from confusion anymore, but from realization beginning to take hold. Ethan's posture shifted, not dramatically, just enough to betray the first crack in his certainty. He glanced toward the officers, then toward the tablet, then back at Darius, as if searching for something that would restore the version of reality he had been so sure of minutes ago. That does not make sense," he said, but the words lacked weight now. They sounded like they were trying to catch up to something that had already moved past them. The woman with the tablet tapped again, bringing up another layer of documentation. Contracts, development permits, corporate filings tied directly to Darius Cole's name. She angled the screen fully toward the officers this time. "No hesitation, no ambiguity." The second officer stepped closer, reading more carefully now, her expression tightening with focus before easing into something else. "Recognition. This is all registered," she said quietly, almost to her partner. "Everything checks out." The first officer nodded slowly, his attention returning to Darius with a different kind of respect. Not forced, not performative. Adjusted. Ethan took a step forward again, but this time it was not to assert control. It was to understand. Or at least to try. "So what are you saying?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier confidence. "That you just walk around here without telling anyone?" The question revealed more than he intended. It exposed the assumption underneath everything that had happened. That presence required permission. That belonging had to be proven. Darius turned his head toward him fully now. Not confrontational, just direct. "I do not need to announce myself to stand on something I built," he said. The sentence was simple, clean, final, and it landed harder than anything that had been said so far. Around them, the crowd shifted again. Not physically, internally. People who had nodded before were no longer nodding. People who had stayed silent were now watching more closely, reevaluating the moment they had stepped into. The woman with the golden retriever lowered her phone completely, her expression no longer uncertain. It was clear. The second officer cleared her throat slightly, stepping forward just enough to reset the tone of the interaction. "Mr. Cole, it appears there has been a misunderstanding," she said. The words were careful, measured, chosen. Darius did not respond immediately. He let the statement exist, unchallenged, as if deciding whether it deserved a response at all. Then he spoke, his voice still calm, but carrying a sharper edge now. "A misunderstanding implies a lack of information," he said. This was something else. The distinction hung in the air, undeniable. Ethan looked down briefly, then back up, his expression no longer certain of anything. The officers did not argue the point. They could not, because the evidence was no longer something to debate. It was something to accept. The first officer adjusted his stance again, his tone now fully aligned with the reality in front of him. "Mr. Cole, we appreciate your cooperation," he said. "We will make sure this situation is resolved appropriately." Darius nodded once. Not in agreement, not in gratitude, in acknowledgement. And as the weight of everything settled over the street, one truth became impossible to ignore. The situation had not escalated because someone did not belong. It had escalated because someone decided, without knowing, that he did not. No one spoke right away. The shift had already happened. It was not loud. It was not dramatic, but it was complete. The weight of Darius Cole's words settled into every corner of the street, into every face that had watched, judged, recorded, and assumed. The officers stood straighter now, no longer managing a situation, but standing inside one they had just begun to understand. Ethan remained where he was, but the space around him felt different. Smaller, tighter, as if the confidence he had carried minutes ago had nowhere left to stand. Darius let the silence hold for a moment longer, not to stretch it, but to let it speak for him. Then he moved, one step forward, controlled, measured, enough to bring him fully into the center of every eye still fixed on him. His gaze swept across the street again. The same houses, the same people, the same place that had questioned his presence without ever questioning its own assumptions. Then he spoke. "You called the police," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm, "on the man who owns every inch of what you were standing on." The sentence did not need emphasis. It carried its own gravity. It landed exactly where it needed to. Ethan's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The officers did not interrupt. The crowd did not react immediately, because the statement did not invite response. It ended the argument. Darius continued, his tone steady, not raised, not aggressive, but sharpened by truth. "You saw someone you did not recognize," he said, "and instead of asking a question, you made a decision." His eyes moved briefly to Ethan, not accusing, not attacking, just direct. "You decided I did. Not belong." The words echoed what had already been said earlier, but now they carried context, meaning, consequence. The second officer lowered her gaze for a moment, not in avoidance, but in acknowledgement. The first officer remained still, his expression composed but changed, as if the role he had stepped into had shifted beneath him. Darius did not rush. He did not fill the silence with unnecessary words. He let each sentence settle before the next one came. "You did not check the records," he continued. "You did not ask the right questions. You did not consider that the problem might not be who I am." A pause. Then the final line landed. "You only considered that I was not supposed to be here." The statement hung in the air, heavier than anything that had come before it. Around them, the crowd felt it, not just as a moment, but as a mirror. Some lowered their phones. Others kept recording, but their posture had changed. The angle was different now. Not capturing a problem, capturing a realization. Ethan shifted his weight again, his voice finally returning, but quieter, stripped of the authority it once carried. "I did not know," he said, the words uncertain, almost defensive, but lacking conviction. Darius looked at him fully now. Calm, unshaken. "That is the point," he replied. No anger, no raised voice, just clarity. The man in the suit behind him remained silent, his presence unchanged, reinforcing what had already been established without needing to say a single word. The woman with the tablet lowered it slightly, her role complete, the facts already delivered. The officers exchanged another glance, but this time it was not about uncertainty. It was about resolution. The first officer took a small step forward, his tone respectful, measured. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we will document what happened here and make sure everything is handled properly." Darius gave a slight nod. Not approval, not dismissal, just acknowledgement. He did not need more than that, because the situation had already corrected itself in the only way that mattered. The truth had been spoken. The assumptions had been exposed. The roles had been reversed without force, without argument, without escalation. And as the street slowly began to breathe again, as the tension loosened its grip on the space it had held so tightly, one thing remained clear to everyone who had witnessed. This was never about trespassing. It was never about identification. It was about perception. And in a single moment, that perception had been dismantled completely. The shift did not reverse. It settled deeper. What had once been a confrontation now felt like a quiet collapse of everything that had fueled it. The officers stepped back slightly, not retreating, but repositioning themselves outside the center of the moment they no longer controlled. The flashing lights from the patrol car dimmed against the stillness of the street, no longer urgent, no longer needed. Ethan remained where he was, but the distance between him and everyone else had grown without him moving an inch. It was not physical. It was something else, something harder to close. A few people lowered their phones completely now, no longer interested in capturing conflict, but processing what they had just witnessed. Others kept recording, but their expressions had changed. The curiosity was gone. What remained was reflection. The woman with the golden retriever slowly stepped back toward the curb, her attention still fixed on Darius, but now with a quiet respect that had not been there before. The man in the suit beside Darius spoke for the first time since everything had been made clear. His voice was calm, professional, but carried a tone that did not invite debate. "We have documented everything," he said, glancing briefly at the officers, "including the call, the statements made, and the timeline of events." The words were not threatening. They were factual, procedural, but they landed with precision. The second officer nodded once, her posture aligning with the shift in reality that had already taken place. "Understood," she said. "We will include that in our report as well." There was no defensiveness in her tone, only acknowledgement, the system correcting itself in real time. Darius did not respond to that exchange. He did not need to. His focus had already moved past the conflict. He turned his head slightly, looking down the street again. The same street, the same houses, but the energy had changed completely. What had felt like resistance now felt like recognition. Not from everyone, not yet, but enough. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice lower than it had been at any point before. "So, what happens now?" The question was not confrontational. It was uncertain, searching. Darius turned back toward him, his expression unchanged, calm, controlled, unmoved by the shift in tone. "Now," he said, "you understand the difference between assumption and reality." The sentence was simple, direct. It did not carry anger. It carried finality. Ethan swallowed slightly, his eyes dropping for a moment before lifting again. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," he said, the words coming slower now, as if he was hearing them for the first time himself. Darius held his gaze. "From what?" he asked. The question was not loud. It did not need to be. It cut through everything else that had been said. Ethan did not answer immediately, because for the first time, the answer was not clear. The crowd felt that too. The silence returned, but this time it was different. Not tense, not waiting, reflective. A few people exchanged glances. Subtle, quiet. The kind of communication that happens when something uncomfortable has been revealed and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. The first officer cleared his throat gently, stepping forward just enough to close the interaction in a way that respected what had already been established. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we appreciate your patience. We will make sure this is properly documented and addressed." Darius nodded once. "That is all I expect," he replied. "No more. No less." The woman with the tablet stepped back slightly, her role complete, her screen dimming as the need for proof had passed. The man in the suit adjusted his stance, his attention shifting subtly back to Darius, awaiting the next instruction without asking for it. The structure of authority had quietly realigned itself, not through force, through truth. Ethan remained still, the weight of the moment settling into him in a way that no argument could have forced. The certainty he had carried was gone. In its place was something quieter, something more difficult to hold on to. The realization that the line he thought he was protecting had never been his to draw. And as the street began to return to something resembling normal, as doors slowly closed and people stepped back into their routines, the moment did not disappear. It stayed, in the way people looked at each other, in the way they looked at Darius, in the way they would think the next time they decided who belonged and who did not. Because what had happened here was not loud. It was not chaotic. It was not something that needed to be repeated to be understood. It was clear, and it had already done what it needed to do. The street did not return to what it was before. It could not. Too much had been seen. Too much had been understood. The patrol car remained for a moment longer before the officers finally stepped back toward it, their movements quieter now, more deliberate, as if aware that their presence had shifted from authority to formality. The flashing lights stopped completely. The engine turned over. And just like that, the symbol of escalation became nothing more than a vehicle leaving a resolved scene. One of the officers gave a final nod toward Darius before getting inside. A gesture small, but meaningful, an acknowledgement that went beyond procedure. The car pulled away slowly, rolling down the same street that had moments ago been filled with tension, now carrying with it the last remnants of a misunderstanding that had already corrected itself. Around them, doors began to close. Conversations resumed, but not in the same tone. There was a softness now, a caution. People who had once stood firmly in assumption now carried something else. Awareness. The woman with the golden retriever walked past Darius, this time not pretending to look at her phone. She met his eyes briefly and gave a quiet nod, a silent apology without words. He returned it with the same calm acknowledgement he had shown throughout the entire moment. No judgment. No need to extend it further. The man in the suit stepped slightly closer, his voice low. "Everything is in place," he said. "We can proceed with the next phase whenever you are ready." Darius nodded once, his attention already shifting forward. The situation behind him no longer required his energy. It had served its purpose. The woman with the tablet tapped once more, locking the screen. The data no longer needed to prove what had already been accepted. The structure of control had reestablished itself, quiet and precise. Ethan remained near the center of the street, but he no longer occupied the moment. He stood slightly off to the side now, his shoulders lowered, his gaze unfocused for a second before settling back on Darius. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words measured, slower than anything he had said before. They did not carry authority. They carried weight. Darius turned toward him, not immediately responding. He let the statement exist on its own, letting it mean what it needed to mean without rushing to define it. Then he spoke. "Being wrong is not the problem," he said calmly. "Staying wrong is." The sentence landed with clarity, not as a reprimand, but as a standard. Ethan nodded slightly, absorbing it, not arguing, not deflecting, just understanding. For the first time, the space between them felt balanced. Not equal in power, but equal in awareness. And that changed everything. Darius looked down the street one more time, his eyes tracing the lines of something he had envisioned long before existed. The homes, the sidewalks, the structure. It was more than a development. It was a statement. And moments like this, uncomfortable as they were, revealed exactly why it mattered. He took a step forward, then another, moving past the place where the confrontation had started, leaving it behind without needing to look back. The man in the suit followed. The woman with the tablet fell into step beside them. The SUV door opened again as they approached, the transition smooth, practiced, unspoken. Before getting in, Darius paused for just a second, his gaze lifting toward the neighborhood one final time. Not with resentment, not with triumph, with clarity. Then he spoke, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for those still within earshot to hear. "I did not raise my voice," he said. "I raised the standard." The words settled into the street like a final signature, not dramatic, not forced, but undeniable. He stepped into the vehicle. The door closed softly. The engine shifted, and as the SUV pulled away, the neighborhood remained behind, quieter than before, but not the same. Because something had changed, not in the buildings, not in the streets, in the people, in a way they would remember this moment, in a way they would think the next time they decided who belonged. And in that quiet shift, something more lasting than any argument had taken place. Something that did not need to be repeated to be understood. Something that stayed.